You're listening to The Money Hour with your host, Tina Mitchell. Sponsored by Absolute Mortgage, a division of Pinnacle Capital Mortgage Corporation. Now, in the studio, local mortgage and finance expert, Tina Mitchell.
Welcome back to the Money Hour with your host and mortgage expert, Tina Mitchell, right here on 1150 AM KKNW, the Saturday, April 9th show, bringing in expert advice and inside knowledge on today's events in our local economy and how it can affect your money. If you're hearing my show at a different time or day, you are listening to a rebroadcast. To talk with the guests that I have in studio, anything you want to share with me, please call the show at 1-855-400-1150. Again, it's 1-855-400-1150 or online at themoneyhour.com. Right now in studio, I have Greg Prill with Coldwell Banker Bain. Today's real estate market and advice for our buyers and sellers. Greg, thank you for coming back and visiting me in studio.
Well, thank you for having me back.
And a little background about Greg is graduate of University of California and Chicago Kent College of Law in Chicago, Illinois. Greg is a licensed Washington State real estate broker and also a licensed attorney in Illinois and Washington states with 15 years of experience in negotiating complex contracts and problem solving. Greg is a broker with Coldwell Banker Bain. He also is a member of the National Association of Realtors and Seattle-King County Association of Realtors. Greg combines his two areas of professional expertise to provide his clients with the best advocacy possible in today's complicated real estate market. Greg is a full-service real estate broker and an attorney with more than a dozen years of experience. Greg is an expert negotiator with an impeccable attention to detail and leverages his two areas of professional expertise to ensure that you find the right home at the right time for the right price. And I will say, Greg, you are definitely a detailed person, which is an extreme benefit in real estate, and especially when you're dealing with the contracts, and then you add in your legal expertise, they're very beneficial. So, Greg, real estate, kind of our conversation, just overall things that are going on. And I'd like to talk about or ask what's going on with new construction.
Absolutely, Tina. New construction is kind of complicated in Washington State because of something called the Growth Management Act. Mm-hmm. And the Growth Management Act was passed in the early 1990s and in essence has created an artificial limit on the amount of buildable land in Washington State. That artificial scarcity means that developers have to find areas that have already been developed and then redevelop them in a process called infill development. And now that process of infill development usually starts with the builder trying to locate a particular parcel that makes sense from an economic perspective, but also fits into the larger plan that the cities in our area have established pursuant to the Growth Management Act. Now, one of the areas that I've been working recently is Ballard, down in Seattle. And one of the interesting things about Ballard is the fact that even though there's been a lot of infill development over the past, maybe dozen or so years, there's still a whole lot of properties out there that are probably going to be converted from single-family residence into four-square townhomes, or what's a little bit more typical nowadays, 3 single-family residences that are put kind of at an angle or with the doors facing maybe the property on the right or the left as opposed to the front doors facing the streets.
Okay.
Yeah. And, when you're trying to figure out what the overall value of your property is, it's real helpful to have somebody who has a little bit of experience in navigating what the zoning regulations are and things along those lines. What I've also found kind of interesting with respect to new construction is that notwithstanding some of the stories that you've heard about prices kind of exploding out of control, especially in Ballard, I did a little bit of research before I came over here today.
I know, I love the chart you brought. I wish we had a visual here for my listeners.
Well, I hear a lot of stories and a lot of scuttlebutt from other brokers as well as just civilians out there. And I always like to go down and dig into the actual numbers and figure out whether or not the scuttlebutt is true. And one of the things that I found is that since January of 2015, prices for new construction housing in Ballard proper have pretty much stayed constant. Now, there's a difference between what it's listed for and what the final sales price is. And lots of folks have this idea that, well, golly, if a new construction townhome or single-family residence is listed for $800,000, it's going to sell for $800,000. And the practical reality is that that's just not true. And so if you were to go into the Wayback Machine and take a look at where prices were in January of 2015, on average, they're obviously above and below average, but on average, houses were being listed for about $690,000 over in Ballard. And that's about what they were selling for. If you were to take a look as of February of this year, the list price for a house is about $672,000, and the sales price is about that price as well. So
interesting.
There really hasn't been the level of appreciation as you would expect.
That's interesting. Interesting stats, Greg. What about for your investors? So when you're coaching and working with your investors, what are you telling them about getting into the market? What advice?
Well, the first thing that I try and counsel them on is have a game plan. And a lot of what I focus in on is trying to figure out why they're doing what they're doing. Maybe that's because of my background where I had to figure out why people were suing each other. But
it all comes back into play here.
but fundamentally, if you don't understand why you're doing something, you're setting yourself up for a whole lot of failure. And that's not why you should be investing. And so typically when I meet with an investor for the first time, we do it over dinner or we do it over lunch, and we just chat about where they are in their life. I want to know where this money's coming from. And, if this is money that they've socked away, there is risk that's involved in investing in real estate. And if this is your only source of retirement income, well, let's not talk about new construction. Let's talk about maybe getting you some rental income that's going to give you a stream of revenue. On the other hand, if you do have a certain amount of money that's been set aside for purely investment purposes, let's figure out what it takes for you to maybe get into the redevelopment business. And then we can have that longer conversation that helps them maximize their ultimate goals and at the same time allows them to sort of get involved in something that's kind of exciting. Building something is really, really exciting. And if you can get on top of it, it's just a really great way for you to contribute to your community and at the same time do right by yourself.
Great advice, Greg. So rents, let's move over to the cost of rents, because rents and what rents are doing have a huge impact on what's going to happen with our real estate market. So what are they doing right now, Greg, and what do you anticipate that they're going to be doing in the future?
Well, so I want to focus in on Seattle, because Seattle has recently passed a number of regulations that is making rentals rather challenging for just mom and pop landowners. Now, if you're a larger company where you're a corporate leasing company with lots of properties, these regulations aren't going to be particularly challenging to you. But if you're a mom and pop investor out there, City of Seattle has decided that they now have a right to knock on the door at least once a year and determine whether or not I think it's a list of 20 or 30 things. I don't remember off the top of my head, but there's a checklist. And if you do not have all your I's dotted and all your T's crossed, you're going to find yourself fined. So from the perspective of rental income, it's great to have somebody who's a very talented and competent and knowledgeable leasing agent. I know that we had a conversation with somebody who specializes in that a little bit earlier. But with respect to rents, given the fact that we have so many cranes that are going up in Seattle right now, most of those cranes are building rental properties right now. And so I would suspect that given, market forces, that we're going to see rents for these new construction buildings probably to start stabilizing over the next 12 to 18 months. I would not anticipate that rental prices are going to come down. That just doesn't seem likely to me, given the fact that we've got Amazon, we've got Google, we've got Facebook coming in.
And the lack of inventory, there's so many people that are forced to still
rent. And so even if you are coming from, say, Missouri, And even if you do have a great signing bonus with a Facebook, guess what? You're probably not going to be able to find a house within a short period of time that you have that corporate housing. So you are going to have to rent something. So from the perspective of somebody who's new to our area and who doesn't have a whole lot of experience with the different neighborhoods, I guess that could be a blessing because you can spend 12 months sort of figuring out what neighborhoods really fit with your individual use case.
Yeah, makes sense. So pre-inspections, Greg, what is, when you're working with your sellers, because I know you work with sellers and buyers, so depending on what side of the fence that you're on there, but when you're working with sellers, do you advise on pre-inspections? And with pre-inspections, are you seeing that buyers are still getting their own inspections as well?
Yeah, that's a real tough question. Washington State is a caveat emptor state, which means basically if you have the ability to find something and you don't, then it's on your shoulders. So, for instance, let's say that there's a house and there's a leak in the toilet. And if a reasonable individual who has a little bit of inspector experience would have found that leak, buyer cannot go after seller after closing for any damage that's a consequence of that leak. So from the perspective of buyers, it's our company policy, Coldwell, Bain, to always have an inspection, or at least to tell our clients that they should have an inspection. With respect to a seller's, I know that our prior guest makes a point of at least encouraging her sellers to have a pre-inspection of their house. I think that can be useful, and ultimately it's a decision for the seller to make. I explained the pros and the cons. I certainly think that it allows the seller to understand if there are problems with the house, things that need to be addressed before it's listed. There's really nothing worse, I think, than thinking that you have a bona fide agreement with somebody that they're going to buy your house for a certain amount of money, only to have an inspector come in and say, golly, did you know about X, Y, and Z? And chances are that you probably didn't. And so while I would not expect an inspection report to lead to a failed sale, it's certainly going to mean that you're going to have to do something at the tail end of a 45-day closing period that's going to be putting a whole lot of stress on your shoulders that you really don't want to experience because you want to get out of your house and move on with the rest of your life.
Well, it's interesting because they just, as you know, realtors just had a few of our popular attorneys come in and do a battle over things that are going on in the real estate, and they talk just about that. And if there are pre-inspections, making sure that your buyers are getting their own inspection. But it was interesting to hear the attorneys talk about that. So contingencies, Greg, what do you see buyers are waiving in those contingencies, and how do you feel about that?
So I guess there's two classes of buyers out there, those that are represented by Greg Prill and those that aren't. I believe that it is important for a buyer to do their due diligence. And this is going to be the largest investment that you're going to be making in your life, unless you're Bill Gates, in which case you've got an entire financial cadre behind you.
Another person, yes.
But most of my clients aren't Bill Gates, so I try and focus them on the idea that, notwithstanding the fact that we do have limited inventory today, if you miss out on this house, there will be another one. And that other house is going to be just as good of a home as the one that you missed out on. And I think that everyone has probably been on the internet recently and has seen those obnoxious ads on the right-hand side of the screen that says, with this one weird trick, you can lose your belly fat. Well, that one weird trick doesn't really exist. You're going to have some discipline to get rid of that belly fat. Similarly, there isn't one weird trick. You aren't going to be able to, right away some of your rights that you have on some of these contingencies for an inspection, for an appraisal, for title contingency, et cetera, et cetera. Simply eliminating some of these things probably isn't going to put you over the top. At least in my experience, it's not going to. And even if it does, do you really want to find something a year after you've purchased a house that your inspector could have found, that could have been remediated? The answer is that no, you don't want to find that 12 months out. You want to find it while you still have some leverage with the seller and you can get things taken care of prior to closing. Yeah.
Great advice, Greg. And I think it's just, the best thing for a buyer or a seller to do is to have all of the information, know what their options are, to get counsel and find out what the best decision is, and then ultimately what they feel that the best decision is, and ultimately make their own decision, having that knowledge.
Well, information is king.
Information is king.
And if you don't have it, then you're really not going to be able to do right by yourself.
Yep.
And you know, it's sometimes difficult to see the expressions on somebody's face when you tell them that they've lost out on a bid.
Yeah.
And of course they say, well, I read this blog that said that if I had just, waived my inspection, then I would have gotten the house. And the practical reality is, again, there's a difference between scuttlebutt and actual experience. And actual experience shows, as somebody who is a listing agent who does list homes, that I do not want to see an offer come through that says that I am waiving my inspection rights. As a seller, I want the buyer to go in there and to find things, because again, Washington state law assumes that if you have the ability to find something, then you should find it, and you're not going to be able to come back to the seller at a later date and say that you hid something.
Got it.
It just makes sense for both buyers and sellers. And I say, hey, as long as you don't have 36 pre-inspections going on prior to an offer acceptance date, I think everybody's going to find themselves much happier, as long as that after you do get to mutual acceptance on a purchase and sale agreement, that the buyer does have the opportunity to have that inspection.
Yeah. Greg, thank you so much for coming back in studio and sharing your advice with my buyers and sellers.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure.
Coming up next on the Money Hour, are you a senior in transition or anyone else in transition needing some help? Or are you helping someone else? Who is working with the estate planner, addresses legal issues, getting everything sorted, packed up and moved? Well, I have Jennifer Black with Caring Transitions Seattle right here on 1150 AM KKNW after this short break.